I thought I was just coming home after a long morning shift, my back aching, my knees stiff, my DoorDash bag still in my hand. I had no idea that 4 words from my daughter's mouth, delivered in the bored, flat tone of someone whose coffee has gone slightly cold, would be the thing that finally broke me open. She was sitting at my kitchen table in the pajamas she'd slept in, phone tilted toward her face, and she looked up at me, still in my jacket, still out of breath from the stairs, and said it like it was the most natural thing in the world. So, no breakfast today? She was 38 years old. I was 71. I had just completed a 4-hour DoorDash shift, gotten in and out of my car 41 times, and driven 11 miles across a city I knew better than my own heartbeat. And my grown daughter wanted to know why her breakfast wasn't ready. I remember the way the morning light came through the kitchen window and fell across her face. I remember thinking something that surprised me with its cleanness, its clarity, like a blade laid flat on a table. Not anymore. The house on Carver Street had been mine for 41 years. Robert and I had bought it in 1983, when the trees on the block were younger and you could still hear crickets at night. 3 bedrooms, 1.5 baths, a kitchen that caught the morning light just right, and a backyard Robert had turned into something close to a paradise. Raised beds, a grape arbor, a fig tree that fruited every August without asking permission from anyone. We raised 2 children there. We grew old there. When Robert died of a heart attack on a Tuesday morning in October 4 years ago, sitting in his chair with his coffee going cold beside him, the house became the place where I learned to be alone. I learned it eventually. I walked every morning. I joined a book club. I cooked smaller portions and stopped apologizing. I fixed the garbage disposal myself with a YouTube tutorial and felt a fierce private pride about it. I was managing. More than managing, actually. I was beginning, quietly, to flourish. Then Tanya called. She had just separated from her husband Paul, needed somewhere to stay while she got back on her feet. I said yes. She was my daughter. I had 2 spare bedrooms. The math seemed obvious. Derek arrived 8 months later, after losing his job at a logistics company for reasons he described as corporate restructuring, and which I later understood involved a missed deadline and a final performance review that had not gone well. He came with his gaming system and 4 garbage bags of clothes, and I gave him the front bedroom, and I said what I had said to Tanya, a few months within reason. That was 19 months before the breakfast question. In 19 months, neither of them had paid $1 of rent. Derek had applied for perhaps a dozen jobs in the first 3 months and then quietly stopped, settling into a rhythm of sleeping until 11 and emerging at noon to build enormous sandwiches from my refrigerator. Tanya worked part-time at a nail salon and spent most of what she earned on things I couldn't account for. The grocery bills had nearly doubled. The utilities for 3 people were a different number than the utilities for 1. I sat at the kitchen table one evening in March with my reading glasses and my bank statements, and the numbers arranged themselves into something that looked like a quiet alarm. I started DoorDash 3 weeks later, 5 mornings a week, 6 to 11, before the heat and before my body had finished registering its objections. I knew every street in this city. I never mixed up orders. In 11 months, I had made 812 deliveries and maintained a 4.9-star rating. And I had made enough to cover the gap without touching my savings. And I was more proud of this than I had expected to be proud of anything that practical. My children were not proud. Tanya had looked at me the first time she saw me heading out with the bag, with an expression of pained embarrassment, and said, "Mom, you don't have to do that," and stopped herself. But I heard the unfinished sentence in the space she left for it. Derek had been more direct. "It's kind of embarrassing. Like, what do I tell people? I had looked at this 34-year-old man who had not contributed $1 to the household sheltering him and said calmly, "Tell them the truth." He had gone back to his game. The discomfort had not left his face. It had simply moved deeper in. There had been other small moments of wrongness in the months before the breakfast morning. Tanya had begun asking precise questions about the house. Had Mom thought about refinancing? Had she done a recent appraisal? Did she know property values on this street had gone up significantly? I answered neutrally and filed the questions away. Derek had started angling his laptop screen away from me in the evenings, every single time I entered the kitchen. A reflex so consistent it had stopped being accidental. A man I didn't recognize had come to the door one Saturday while I was in the garden. Tanya said he was a neighbor interested in the area, and the explanation had been a fraction too quick, a fraction too smooth. The pieces were there. I had simply not yet allowed myself to assemble them. Then came the Tuesday, 1 week before the breakfast morning. I came home early from my shift. My back had been insistent, and I stopped at the top of the stairs because Derek's voice was coming from behind Tanya's half-open door, tight and rapid and low. "She doesn't have to know until it's filed," he was saying. And then Tanya's voice, quieter but firmer. "Gerald said the DoorDash thing is actually useful. A judge will—" And then a truck passed outside and swallowed the rest. I stood on the landing with my hand against the wall, feeling the raised grain of the old paint under my fingertips, and I thought, Gerald, a judge. The DoorDash thing is useful. I went to my room. I sat on the edge of the bed. I told myself I was jumping to conclusions, and for 3 days I almost believed it. Then I found the folder. It was at the bottom of Derek's laundry pile on the washing machine. A fat manila folder with a rubber band around it and nothing written on the outside. "This is your house," I thought. And I opened it. The first page was a letter. Letterhead. The Law Office of Gerald A. Whitmore, Elder Law and Estate Planning, addressed to Tanya, dated 11 days earlier. I read the first paragraph 3 times because the words assembled into the same meaning every time, and I needed them to mean something else. "Dear Ms. Harlow, pursuant to our meeting of the 14th, I believe we have a viable basis to proceed with a petition for limited conservatorship. The subject's continued employment in a physically demanding gig economy role, unusual for a person of her age, combined with the financial irregularities noted in the provided bank statements, may serve as behavioral indicators supporting a finding of diminished capacity to manage her own financial affairs." I put the page down. My hands were completely still, flat against the folder, and the stillness was the wrong kind of calm, the kind that comes just before things freeze. I kept reading. The letter discussed the value of my house, nearly $400,000 above what we had paid for it. It discussed a timeline. It discussed what would need to be documented in terms of my daily functioning. It used the phrase resistance to family guidance to describe what I would have called refusing to sell my home. There were printed emails between Tanya and Derek, between Tanya and Whitmore, between Derek and a geriatric case assessor named Barb, who'd been retained to evaluate me. My bank statements with yellow highlighter marking my DoorDash deposits as suspicious. A handwritten note in Derek's handwriting. Need more examples of confusion or forgetting. Ask Carol. Carol was my sister. I sat down on the laundry room floor. It was cold and hard and smelled of detergent. And I sat there for a very long time, and outside the small frosted window, the birds were still making their ordinary morning sounds, as if nothing had changed. I read the folder twice. By the second reading, The numbness had become something else, not hot anger, but a cold, ferocious clarity. I put the folder back exactly as I had found it. I started the washing machine. I went upstairs and changed my clothes and came back down and put on water for tea. And when Derek came down at 11:15 in his socks and his gaming shirt and said, "Morning," I handed him the cereal box and said, "Good morning," in a voice that gave nothing away, and I thought, I see you. I see exactly what you are. And you have made a very serious mistake. That night I called Carol. She had received a call from Tanya 3 weeks earlier, she told me. Tanya had said I was acting confused, making impulsive financial decisions, that the DoorDash job was a sign I wasn't thinking clearly about my own safety. Carol had told her I'd seemed fine in both calls that week. "I thought she was being dramatic," Carol said. "I didn't realize. Maggie, this is elder financial abuse. Call an attorney tomorrow morning." I did not sleep that night. I lay in the dark and listened to the house, Derek's floorboards at 2 a.m, Tanya's television through the wall, and I thought about the folder and the yellow highlighter and the phrase resistance to family guidance. And I thought about Paul, Tanya's ex-husband Paul, who had sat at this kitchen table at Thanksgiving once and said quietly, "Tanya is very smart, Margaret. Sometimes she uses that in ways that aren't good." I had not understood him then. I understood him now. By morning, I had a plan. I called Robert's estate attorney, Gerald Moore, at 8:15. He told me to bring the folder, change my banking passwords immediately, document every financial conversation my children had initiated in the past year, and not to confront them yet. I spent the morning at his office and the afternoon organizing 3 years of tax returns, DoorDash earnings summaries, and bank records into a picture of a woman who was not only competent but financially precise. 812 deliveries, a 4.9 rating, consistent weekly deposits. I also called Paul from my car, 2 blocks from the house, and Paul said he had been afraid of something like this, and that he remembered conversations during their marriage in which Tanya had described my house as a future asset, had tracked its value online for years, had once said in a fight, "My mother's house is worth $400,000. That's not nothing." He said he would provide a written statement. I said I'd be in touch. I also visited my branch manager and added in-person verification requirements to any large transfers. And I picked up a letter from my doctor confirming that my cognitive and physical health were excellent, that my continued driving work was medically beneficial, and that she saw no indicators of diminished capacity whatsoever. She had noted this last part with what seemed like mild professional amusement. I had both documents in a folder of my own the next morning when I came home from my shift and found my daughter in her pajamas. I set my DoorDash bag on the counter. I took off my jacket and hung it on the hook. The small aluminum hook I had installed myself after Robert kept meaning to and never did, and the memory of that hook steadied me in a way I hadn't expected. I turned around. I sat down at the kitchen table directly across from Tanya and folded my hands on the surface the way I used to fold them in front of my 4th grade students when something important was about to be said. Tanya's eyes came up from her phone. Something in her expression shifted. "I found the folder," I said. The silence that followed was the loudest I had experienced since the morning they called to tell me Robert was gone. Tanya's face went very still, not guilty, not collapsed, but calculating, contained. She said, "What folder?" I named each item the way you lay cards face up on a table. Whitmore's letter, the bank statements with yellow highlighter, Derek's note about Carol, the emails. Barb, the cognitive assessor, the property valuation. I said each one with enough space between them to let the weight land. "Mom, we were worried," Tanya said, and her voice had found its reasonable register, the armored version of concern. "You're working a physically demanding job in traffic at 71. That's not—" "You retained an attorney without telling me," I said. "You had my bank statements printed. You were building a case to have me declared incompetent so you could control this house." I kept my voice level and quiet, because quiet was the thing they couldn't use against me. "I have spoken to my attorney. I have my doctor's letter. I have your bank statement access documented. And I have a letter from Paul." That was the first crack. A small contraction around Tanya's eyes, a tightening at her mouth. Paul. She had not expected Paul. The kitchen door opened and Derek came in, drawn by the frequency of crisis that siblings transmit across walls. He stopped when he saw our faces. His eyes went immediately to Tanya, not to me, to her. And that reflex told me everything I had not been completely certain of. He had not been reluctant or coerced. He had been a co-conspirator from the beginning. "Sit down," I said. He sat. I told them what Gerald Moore and I had agreed I would say, that Whitmore had been contacted and advised his clients to withdraw, that my accounts were secured, that my doctor's letter and Paul's statement were on file, that I had documented every financially oriented conversation they had initiated over the past 12 months, including the questions about refinancing, the property valuation meeting with the man who had come to my door, all of it. Derek stared at the table. His jaw was set. He was deeply ashamed, not of what he had done, but of being seen doing it, which is a smaller and less useful kind of shame. "You have 30 days, I said. Tanya looked up. "Both of you. Gerald Moore is drafting the formal notice to vacate today. 30 days is the legal minimum in this state, and that is what you will receive." I stood. I picked up my coffee. There is cereal in the cabinet and bread on the counter. I walked out of the kitchen. I walked upstairs. I sat on the edge of my bed and looked out at Robert's grape arbor, the leaves turning at the edges in the early autumn light, bronze and rust creeping into the green, and I breathed, slowly, carefully, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt the house settle around me the way it used to, solid and mine. Something I did not have to apologize for or defend or share before I was ready. The 30 days were not peaceful. Tanya cycled between fury and guilt-laden appeals. I was punishing my children for loving me. The DoorDash job was genuinely dangerous. She had been frightened and hadn't known another way. Some of it almost worked on me, not the conservatorship argument, which was indefensible, but the older material, woven from 38 years of being her mother. I felt the pull. I held it alongside the memory of the folder, and I did not move. Derek left on day 12, apologizing by text the night before. I read the message and waited 3 days before responding, because the apology was sincere and also 14 months late. I texted back that I wished him well and meant it. I loved my son. I simply could not love him at close range anymore without it costing me something I was no longer willing to pay. Tanya left on the 28th day, no goodbye in person. She left the room smelling of her perfume, light, floral, always hers. And I left the window open for a week to clear it, and I stood in the doorway of the empty room one morning and felt something complicated. Not triumph, not quite grief, but the place where those two things live in the same breath, the feeling that knows exactly what things cost. Gerald Whitmore confirmed in writing that all proceedings had been withdrawn. Gerald Moore filed the required report with Adult Protective Services. No criminal charges. What had been done occupied a legal gray area. But it was documented, and on record, and mine. 6 months later, the house on Carver Street is mine again in every way that counts. I repainted the back bedroom pale green, the color it was when Tanya was born. Not erasure, but reclaiming. I fixed the porch light myself. I got a small terrier from the shelter named Harold, who takes morning walks with me before my shifts and sometimes rides in the passenger seat on easy days. I still drive for DoorDash. 3 mornings a week now, because my back asked me to, and I've learned to listen to it without apology. My rating is still 4.9. There is a stretch of road on the east side, wide and quiet in the early morning with the light low and golden. And when I drive it on a good day, I feel something I don't have an exact word for. Something close to what it must feel like to be fully, uncomplicatedly yourself. Carol comes for dinner the second Sunday of every month and always brings wine. Paul came by on a Saturday in October, and we sat on the porch for 3 hours talking about everything. And it was one of the better afternoons I'd had in years. My children and I are not estranged, cooler, more careful, more honest, which is perhaps what we should have been all along. The fig tree gave its last fruits in late October. I picked them before my shift one morning, standing in Robert's garden in the early light with Harold watching from the porch steps, and I ate one right there. Warm, sweet, exactly itself. Robert used to say the fig tree was the most honest thing in the garden. It gives what it has, when it has it, without apology or negotiation, until someone asks it to be something else. And then it simply is not. I was taken for granted. I was underestimated. I was planned against by 2 people who had once called for me in the dark from these same rooms. I had believed for a long time that enduring that was the loving thing to do. Now I know. A tree does not apologize for its roots. Neither will I. But the story does not end with me sitting on my bed looking at the grape arbor. That would be too clean, and the truth was not clean. The truth had a second act and a third, and several scenes in between that I have not yet told you about because they are the hardest ones to tell. Not because they are dramatic, but because they are the scenes in which I was most tested and in which I came closest to retreating back into the woman I had been for 19 months. Patient, accommodating, swallowing everything and calling it love. The second confrontation happened 3 days after the first. I had been careful in those 3 days, careful in the specific way that people are careful when they are living alongside a situation that has been named but not yet resolved, when the documents have been filed and the words have been spoken, but the bodies are still in the same house, still passing each other in the hallway, still reaching for the same coffee pot in the morning. I said good morning. I cooked for myself and left the kitchen clean. I did not avoid anyone, and I did not seek anyone out. I was courteous in the way that stone walls are courteous, present, complete, not giving anything away. It was a Thursday evening. I was at the kitchen table reading when Tanya came downstairs with what I recognized immediately as a prepared expression, something composed in private, rehearsed, the emotional equivalent of a speech written out and memorized. She sat down across from me the way I had sat across from her 3 days before, and for a strange moment I almost admired the mirroring of it. She had her hands folded on the table. She had changed into real clothes, not pajamas, which told me she had made an effort. "Mom," she said, "I need you to understand something." I put my book down. I looked at her. I said nothing. "I know what we did was wrong," she said. "I know how it looks, but I need you to understand where it came from." She took a breath. The breath was controlled, measured, the breath of a person who has decided to appear vulnerable without actually becoming it. "After Dad died, I watched you. I watched you get thinner and quieter and more stubborn, and I was frightened for you, and I didn't know how to talk to you about it without you shutting me out, because that's what you do, Mom. You shut people out. You make everything look fine. You never ask for help. And then you took this job, this DoorDash job, and I kept thinking about you out there alone at 6 in the morning in traffic, and Tanya, I said. She stopped. "I believe that somewhere underneath everything you did, there is a version of this that started with worry," I said. "I do believe that. You are still my daughter, and I know you." I kept my hands flat on the table. "But I need you to hear what I'm about to say very carefully. And I need you to actually listen, not listen for the moment when you can respond." I paused. "You did not take me to a doctor. You did not sit down with me and say, 'Mom, I'm worried. Can we talk?' You did not call me and say, 'I've noticed some things. How are you really doing?' You went to an attorney. You printed my bank statements. You had a man come to my house under a false pretext to assess the property value. You retained a professional to evaluate my cognitive function without my knowledge. And you did all of this while living in my house, eating my food, paying no rent, and letting me work every morning to cover the expenses your presence created." I let that sit. "That is not fear. That is a plan." Tanya's prepared expression was gone. Underneath it was something rawer and less organized, something that might have been genuine, though by this point I had lost my ability to be certain. Her eyes were bright in the kitchen light. Her hands, still folded on the table, had tightened against each other. "We needed the money," she said, and it came out in a different register than anything she had said before. Lower, stripped of the rehearsed quality. "Paul took everything in the divorce, everything we had built, everything I thought was mine. And I came home, and I saw this house, and I knew what it was worth, and I thought—" She stopped. She pressed her lips together. "I thought there had to be a way to do something that was good for everyone, that if we could manage the asset properly, if we could—" "Manage the asset," I said. She flinched. "That is my home," I said. "That is 41 years. That is your father's hands in that garden. That is the room where you were sick with fever when you were 7, and I sat on the floor next to your bed all night because you were afraid of the dark. That is not an asset. That is my life." I kept my voice quiet. I was not going to shout. I had decided that the night Robert died, in a different context and for a different reason, that I was not going to spend whatever time I had left being loud about the things that mattered most. The things that mattered most deserved quiet. "I'm not going to manage it for you, Tanya. Not for you, not for Derek, not for anyone. It is mine, and I intend to die in it, and whoever gets it when I am gone will get it, because I chose to give it to them. Not because a judge decided I was no longer capable of making that choice myself." Tanya was quiet for a long time. Outside, a car passed on Carver Street, its headlights sweeping briefly through the kitchen window. Harold, who had been asleep in his bed near the radiator, shifted and sighed the theatrical sigh of dogs who are pretending to be more deeply asleep than they are. "I'm sorry," Tanya said finally, and this time the two words came out without architecture around them, small and unguarded, and I heard in them the child who had once been afraid of the dark. "I know," I said. "I believe you. But sorry is the beginning of something, not the end of it. You still have to leave." She went upstairs. I sat alone in the kitchen for a while, in the light and the quiet, listening to Harold breathe and to the refrigerator's low hum and to the particular silence of a house in which something significant has just been said. I did not feel victorious. I did not feel relieved exactly. I felt the complicated, specific weight of loving someone who has hurt you deliberately and whom you will not stop loving and whom you cannot go on protecting at your own expense. I felt it the way you feel weather, not as something you chose, but as something real that you are simply standing inside of. I made myself a cup of chamomile tea and took it to the porch. The night was cool and clear, and the street was quiet. I sat in Robert's chair, the good wicker chair that had survived 4 decades and 2 children, and 1 bad winter when I had accidentally left it out in a frost. And I drank my tea and looked at the street and at the yellow glow of the street lamps on the wet pavement, and I thought, I am 71 years old, and I am sitting on my porch, in my chair, in front of my house, on a Thursday night in autumn, drinking my tea. No one has taken anything from me. Everything that matters is still here. And I am, despite everything, all right. I went inside and locked the door, which was something I had started doing again recently. Not out of fear exactly, but out of a reclaimed sense of what was mine to lock. Derek's departure, when it came on the 12th day, was quieter than I expected. I had imagined, not consciously but somewhere in the background of my thinking, that it might be loud, that there might be a final argument or an accusation or some version of the kind of scene that families have when things are ending. Instead, I heard his door open at 9 in the morning and his feet on the stairs and the particular sound of someone carrying boxes. And when I came out of my bedroom, he was standing at the bottom of the staircase with 2 duffel bags and his gaming system case, and an expression I had not seen on his face since he was 11 years old and had broken a neighbor's window with a baseball and had to come and tell me about it. He looked like a boy. That was the thing that undid me slightly, the single thing that required me to hold myself very still for a moment to keep my face where I had decided to keep it. He looked like the boy I had raised, the child who had been curious and funny and surprising. Before, somewhere along the way, the world had squeezed those things out of him and left behind the man who angled his laptop screen away from his mother. I did not know what had happened in between. I probably never would. The distance between who our children were and who they become is one of the griefs of parenthood that no one adequately prepares you for. "I'm going to Marcus's," he said. Marcus was his oldest friend from high school, a good person who had always been steadier than Derek. "He has a pull-out couch." "Good," I said. He picked up his bags. He stood there a moment longer, the way people do when they are trying to decide whether there is more to say. Then he said, "The fig tree has 3 figs left, by the way. I checked this morning." I looked at him. He looked at me. This was the most honest thing Derek had said to me in 19 months, and we both knew it, and neither of us acknowledged it directly, and that was fine. Some things communicate better in the space around words than in the words themselves. "I'll get them before it rains," I said. He nodded. He went out the door. I heard his car start in the driveway and then pull away, and then the street was quiet again, and I went to the kitchen and made coffee and stood at the window looking out at the garden and at the fig tree and counted 3 small dark figs near the top where the branches thinned and the light got in easily. I got them that afternoon. They were perfect. 2 weeks after Tanya left, Paul came by on a Saturday afternoon as we had arranged, and I want to tell you about that visit because it was important in a way I had not anticipated when I invited him. He arrived at 2 o'clock with a bottle of decent Burgundy and the slightly careful look of a man who is not sure what he is walking into. He was 43, tall, with the slightly rumpled quality of someone who had recently reorganized their life and was still figuring out where everything went. He had brought the wine as if he were coming to dinner, which I thought was either confident or hopeful, and I appreciated both qualities. I had put 2 chairs on the porch and made a plate of things from the garden, the last of the season's figs, some cheese, crackers. And when he came up the porch steps and saw the setup, he relaxed in a way I found reassuring. We talked for 3 hours. We talked about his work. He was in structural engineering, which I had always found interesting, and which he was modest about in the way that people who are genuinely competent in technical things often are. We talked about the divorce, briefly, and the years before the divorce, and the particular loneliness of being unhappy inside something that looks fine from the outside. We talked about Robert, and I found, as I sometimes still do, that talking about Robert in the company of someone who had known him, even just at holiday dinners, even just in passing, was different from talking about him with people who hadn't. There was a shared reference, a common ground, and it made the talking easier. He asked me about DoorDash, not in the way my children had asked, not with the pained subtext of embarrassment or the angled concern of people with agendas, but directly, with genuine curiosity, wanting to know what it was like to do it, whether the app was intuitive, what the strangest delivery I'd ever made was. I told him about the woman on the 7th floor of the residential tower on the east side who ordered from the same Thai restaurant every Tuesday and Thursday at exactly 6:45 in the morning and always tipped 30% and always left a note that said, "Thank you. I hope your day is wonderful." I told him about the time I had delivered to what turned out to be a surprise party for a woman my age, and how the whole room had cheered when I came through the door with the bags because they had been waiting on the food, and how for a brief, hilarious moment, I had been the most popular person in a room of 40. Paul laughed, and it was a real laugh, the kind that doesn't perform itself, and I thought, this is what it is supposed to feel like. Easy and unhurried, 2 people on a porch on an autumn afternoon with no agenda and no angle and nowhere they need to be. He left at 5 and said he'd like to do this again, and I said I thought that would be fine, and I meant it. The legal matters resolved themselves over the following weeks in the way that legal matters do, incrementally, with paperwork, in language that is designed to contain human disasters within professional structures. Gerald Moore filed the Adult Protective Services report as required. Gerald Whitmore sent a formal letter withdrawing all proceedings. There was a brief and uncomfortable period in which Whitmore's office suggested that the matter could be considered a miscommunication between family members regarding health care planning, which was such a precise piece of legal language for what had actually happened that I spent a full minute reading it before asking Gerald Moore to respond with the phrase, "We do not agree with that characterization," and move on. The bank irregularity, the unauthorized access to my statements, fell into a gray area that Gerald Moore said we could pursue further if I chose to. I thought about it. I sat with it for a week, the way you sit with a decision that has permanence in it. Then I decided not to pursue it, not because I had forgiven the act, but because I had assessed the cost of continuing to fight it against the cost of letting it stand as documented and on record, and the second option felt like the more livable one. I was not interested in destroying my children. I was interested in not being destroyed by them. There is a difference. and it matters. What I did pursue was a formal revision of my estate documents. I sat with Gerald Moore for 2 hours on a November afternoon and went through everything: the will, the power of attorney, the beneficiary designations. And I made changes that were measured and deliberate and that expressed, in legal language, exactly where I stood. The power of attorney went to Carol, who had been my first call on the night I found the folder and who had given me the right advice without asking for anything in return. The house, in the revised will, was to be sold at fair market value upon my death, and the proceeds divided equally between my 2 children and 3 specific charities I had supported for years. Not given directly, sold first. The asset managed cleanly, on my terms, at my timing, as it always should have been. Carol cried a little when I told her about the power of attorney. She said she didn't want to think about me needing it. I told her that was precisely the right attitude, and also that the point was to make sure that the people who had thought about it too much were not the ones who ended up with it. There is one more thing I want to tell you. It happened in December, 2 months after the breakfast morning, on a cold, gray Saturday when the garden had gone fully dormant and the fig tree was bare, and the grape arbor was just bones, and the raised beds were empty and dark under a thin crust of frost. I was in Robert's workshop, the small outbuilding at the back of the property that I had not really gone into in 4 years, not since he died, because going into it had always felt like a thing I needed to be ready for, and I had not been ready. I was ready now, or ready enough, which is probably all any of us ever are. His tools were exactly as he had left them, the chisels on the pegboard in order of size, the sandpaper in its labeled boxes on the shelf, the smell, pine resin and linseed oil and something metallic and particular, something that was simply the smell of that room, of his hands and his work, and 4 decades of Saturday mornings, was so intact, so completely itself, that I stood in the doorway for a moment with my hand on the frame and let it happen, whatever it was going to do to me. It did not undo me. It did something gentler and more complicated than that. It reminded me of something I had known and then set aside in the years of grief and adjustment, and now remembered that Robert had built things, not just the garden, not just the raised beds and the grape arbor, but furniture, and a bookcase in the hallway that had never once wobbled in 30 years, and a toy chest for the children that still sat in the corner of the back bedroom. He had built things that lasted. He had taken raw material and made it into something that held shape, that served its purpose, that kept faith with whoever used it. I stood in the workshop for a long time. I looked at his tools. I thought about what I had spent the last 2 months building, not from wood, but from something more resistant and more durable. I had built a boundary. I had built documentation and legal protection and a revised will and a secured bank account and a revised understanding of what my love for my children was and was not obligated to include. I had built, out of the rubble of 19 months of being taken for granted and 1 week of finding out how far that could go, something that would hold, something that would keep faith with me. I turned the workshop light on. I looked at every tool on the pegboard. Then I found his smallest plane, the one he used for finishing work, and I ran my thumb along the blade the way I had watched him do 1,000 times, testing the edge. It was still sharp. Of course it was still sharp. Robert kept his tools exactly right. I put it back on the pegboard. I turned off the light. I walked back to the house across the frozen garden under a December sky the color of old pewter, with Harold running ahead of me in the frost. And I went inside and put the kettle on. And I stood at the window in the warmth and looked out at the dormant garden and at the bare fig tree standing at the center of it, patient and root-bound and exactly itself, and I thought, next spring it will fruit again. It always does. So will I.